Hi, I'm glad you're here. On this channel, we usually talk about the darker side of humanity, true crime and justice, the things society tries to bury. But sometimes the most haunting stories aren't about murder or mystery, they're about what we choose to forget, who we ignore, and how easy it is to turn our backs on the very things that once stood by us. Today's story isn't about a criminal in the traditional sense. It's about a quiet betrayal, one we've all been part of without realizing it. Because hidden in plain sight all over our cities is a creature that used to be sacred, intelligent, loyal, even heroic, and now most people won't even make eye contact with it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how pigeons went from gods to ghosts. This is the true story you were never told, the dark history of pigeons. Chapter 1. A Spy with Feathers. I've read a lot of strange headlines in my time, especially while researching stories for this channel. But there's one that really stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't a crime of blood and murder like the usual ones I cover, but it was a crime of perception, misunderstanding, and maybe something even darker. The headline, it came from the New York Times and read Pigeon, was cleared of being a Chinese spy but served 8 months anyway. At first I laughed. I mean, a pigeon's a spy. Really. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Why didn't the bird just fly away? What did they even think it did? And seriously, who interrogates a pigeon? It sounds absurd, I know. But that headline, it's not fiction, it's not satire. It's a real story from May of 2023. According to reports, a pigeon was spotted hanging around a port in India. Nothing unusual, just a bird doing what birds do. But when authorities got closer, they noticed something odd. Around its leg was a small ring, one that looked suspiciously like a microchip. And if that wasn't enough, there was Chinese writing on the bird's wings. That's all it took. In a moment of international tension layered with fierce suspicion and a long history of distrust, this pigeon was declared a spy. Indian officials locked it up quite literally for 8 months. No trial, no defense, just a cell and a bird. Later, after everything it turned out, the pigeon wasn't from China. It wasn't a spy. It was a racing pigeon from Taiwan, and the writing had faded too much to be clearly read. So here's what I couldn't shake. Why did so many people, trained officials, no less genuinely believe a pigeon could be a vessel of espionage? That question led me down a path I wasn't expecting. Because the truth is, they weren't entirely wrong. You see, history has a funny way of folding in on itself. The things we now mock or overlook often had deep, powerful meaning in the past. And pigeons. These birds we treat like flying pests today. They weren't always seen that way. In fact, not that long ago, pigeons were trusted allies, messengers, war heroes, symbols of love, fertility, and even national security. And then just like that, they were discarded, slandered, and left behind. This story isn't just about a bird locked in a cage for no reason. It's about how we build myths, tear them down, and replace them with fear. It's about how a species that once stood beside us in our most desperate moments became the target of ridicule and extermination. So today, we're not talking about a murder case. We're talking about an erasure, a betrayal. This is the story of how we took one of humanity's oldest and most loyal companions and turned them into rats with wings. Welcome to the forgotten, misunderstood, and downright bizarre history of pigeons. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Legacy. You know what's funny? Before this story, I never thought twice about pigeons. I saw them like most people do, these kind of dumpy gray birds bobbing around parks, picking at scraps, maybe sitting awkwardly on a statue. I used to call them sky rats. And I feel awful admitting that now. But the deeper I dug into their story, the more ashamed I felt about how little I knew. Because these birds, the ones we treat like flying trash cans today, were once treasured, admired, even worshipped. Yeah, worshipped. Turns out pigeons have been with us from the very beginning. As far back as 10,000 years ago, when early humans first began to settle and farm in a place called the Fertile Crescent, this beautiful crescent-shaped region in the Middle East that essentially gave birth to modern civilization, pigeons were right there. not just flying around, but living among us. We didn't just eat them, we honored them. In ancient Mesopotamia, people saw pigeons as symbols of fertility. They built little clay statues of them, placed them in temples, and associated them with powerful goddesses. Ishtar, the goddess of love war, and everything messy in between, had the dove as her sacred animal. And remember, back then, doves and pigeons weren't considered different. That whole dove equals peace pigeon equals dirty thing. That's a modern invention. Scientifically, they're the same bird. And yet, somewhere along the way, we decided to give the white small ones a halo, and the gray, city-dwelling ones a death sentence. But I'll get to that part later. Back in ancient times, people didn't just admire pigeons because they were pretty or spiritual. They noticed something else, something that almost felt like magic. No matter how far they flew, pigeons always found their way back home. Always. Now imagine what that meant for ancient humans, people who had no cell phones, no Google Maps, no postal service. Suddenly, here was a creature that could travel, far remember where it came from, and return without getting lost. That was revolutionary. At first, they were used for food, religion, and symbolism. But once humans discovered their incredible homing ability, that's when the real bond began. We started to understand their patterns, their loyalty, their intelligence. We began to breed them, raise them, and rely on them. Not just as pets or sacrifices, but as partners. And the truth is, they didn't ask for much in return. Just a place to roost, a little food, and maybe a chance to stretch their wings and find their way back. It was a quiet relationship, unspoken, built on trust and instinct. But it worked. For thousands of years, it worked. That's what struck me the most as I kept reading how long this mutual partnership had existed, and how deeply it was rooted in survival both for them and for us. Today, we treat pigeons like freeloaders, but history tells a different story. There was a time when pigeons weren't just allowed to exist among us, they were invited. And honestly, maybe it's time we start remembering that. Chapter 3. Nature's Compass. You ever wonder how some animals just know where they're going? Like truly know? Because I get lost in parking garages, I'm not even kidding. I can walk out of Target, turn around, and have no clue where I left my car. But pigeons. Pigeons can fly over mountains, rivers, entire cities, and still find their way home like it's nothing. That's not an exaggeration. Pigeons have been documented flying back to their nests from over 1,000 miles away. No GPS, no map, no breadcrumbs, just instinct. It's wild. So I started asking myself, how do they do it? I mean, really. What is it that makes pigeons so special? And the answer is kind of mind-blowing. Scientists believe pigeons have multiple built-in navigation tools. First, they're able to track the position of the sun. I know. It already sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but it's real. Even on cloudy days, pigeons can use polarized light patterns to determine where the sun is and use that to orient themselves. But that's just the beginning. They also have something called magnetoreception. Basically, pigeons can sense the Earth's magnetic field, like they have an internal compass embedded in their bodies. Some researchers think they carry tiny magnetic crystals in their beaks that help them detect direction and even intensity of the magnetic field around them. Others believe it has to do with the inner ear. Truth is, no one knows for sure. We've studied it for decades and we're still baffled. And then there's smell. Yeah, pigeons actually use scent to guide them home. As they get closer to familiar territory, they follow odors like the smell of their coop, the local plants, even the scent of their own droppings to guide them back. It's not glamorous, but it works. And finally, they rely on sight. Once they're close, pigeons use landmarks to lock in their location, buildings, trees, even specific rooftops. They remember, they visualize. It's like they store a mental map of the world and update it as they go. What really stunned me was learning that pigeons are capable of understanding spatial relationships, almost like they grasp the concept of geography. They can remember not only where they are, but how places connect to each other. That level of cognitive mapping is something we usually associate with much more complex animals or humans. It made me think we've spent years underestimating these birds because they don't fit our idea of intelligence. But just because they don't speak or emote like we do doesn't mean they're not incredibly smart. They're just smart in a way we don't always understand or maybe don't bother to understand. And yet, for thousands of years, people did understand. They recognized the pigeon's gifts and used them with incredible precision. From carrying wartime messages to delivering news across cities, pigeons became part of our communication systems long before the telegraph or the telephone were ever invented. But before humans could rely on them, they had to tame them, train them, create a bond. That part of the story begins in Egypt with a pharaoh, a sacrifice, and the start of something much bigger than anyone at the time could have imagined. Chapter 4: Pharaoh's Sacrifices and the First Pigeon Network. It's strange to think about now, but once upon a time, pigeons were considered divine, literal messengers of the gods. And of all the places where this belief took root, ancient Egypt was one of the most important. We often associate Egypt with pyramids, mummies, and golden tombs, but their relationship with animals went far deeper than we usually give them credit for. Cats, crocodiles, falcons, they were all woven into the Egyptian worldview. But pigeons, they had their own chapter in that story too. Somewhere around 1200 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II, who, by the way, ruled for 66 years and is still considered one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history, pigeons were elevated to something more than just birds. They became offerings, gifts to the gods. Ramses believed that in order to honor Amun, the king of the gods, something meaningful had to be sacrificed. And what better way to show devotion than by giving up something the people actually valued? Because at that point, pigeons weren't just symbols, they were food, a lifeline for survival. So, giving them up was a big deal. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of the pigeons people used to catch lived far from the city centers, scattered across cliffs, rocks, or wild regions, hundreds of miles away. It was a logistical nightmare. So instead of chasing them, Ramses did what humans do best. When we want to control nature, he brought them in. He started breeding pigeons inside palace grounds, controlled environments, purpose-built towers, the first real attempt at large-scale pigeon domestication. And it worked. Soon, pigeons weren't just sacred, they were predictable, breedable, available. Suddenly, you didn't need to wait for the gods to send a message through a bird. You had a whole flock at your disposal. Historical records suggest Ramses sacrificed over 57,000 pigeons in one ceremony. That's not a typo. 57,000. And it wasn't because they were pests, it was because they were precious, chosen. That's what made the sacrifice so powerful. But somewhere in the space between worship and utility, something shifted. We realized pigeons could do more than sit in temples or end up on a dinner plate. People began to notice their remarkable homing instincts. And for the first time, pigeons were seen as a way to communicate across distance. Without wires, without human messengers, just wings and memory, it didn't take long for others to catch on. Stories about pigeons delivering critical information began to surface across ancient texts. In the Bible, Noah sends out a white dove, again a pigeon by scientific standards, to search for dry land after the flood. The bird returns with an olive branch, the signal of hope, the start of something new. In ancient Greece, pigeons were used to announce Olympic victors to distant cities. No fanfare, no trumpets, just a pigeon quietly doing its job. Even Julius Caesar, yes, that Caesar relied on pigeons during his military campaigns. According to Roman historians, he was among the first to systematize the use of pigeons for wartime communication. While other armies relied on messengers who could be intercepted, captured, or killed, Caesar had birds that didn't stop for fear or fatigue. And over time, the bird that once symbolized love and gods became something else entirely, a tool of strategy, a link between empires, a quiet thread stitching together events that shaped the world. I don't know about you, but to me, that's where the story gets really fascinating. Because it's not just about pigeons anymore. It's about how humans transform what they don't fully understand into something they can use. We took a sacred symbol and made it a system. We took mystery and turned it into message. And as you'll see in the next chapter, that shift from reverence to utility would eventually lead to something even more unexpected, a status symbol for the elite. And eventually, a full-blown obsession. Chapter 5. Wings of the Elite. You know, there's something fascinating about the way we humans operate. The moment we figure out how to control something, anything really, we start assigning value to it. Not just in terms of utility, but in terms of status. And pigeons, they weren't immune to that. Once people realized these birds could find their way home from hundreds of miles away, once they proved themselves as reliable, trainable, and shockingly smart, the game changed. Pigeons stopped being just useful. They became exclusive. By the 1600s over in England and France, the wealthy had taken their fascination to a whole new level. It wasn't enough to just admire pigeons anymore. You had to own them, breed them, show them off like jewelry. The upper class began constructing elaborate towers on their estates just for pigeons. These weren't cages, they were called dovecotes, and they looked like ornate castles for birds. Some were so massive they became architectural landmarks. And here's the kicker, the number of pigeons you kept and the grandeur of your dovecote became a direct reflection of your social standing. It was like, oh, you only have 30 pigeons, poor thing. By the mid-1600s, there were over 26,000 dovecotes across England alone. That's not a niche hobby, that's a movement. And while it all sounds a little ridiculous, pampering birds, flexing your wealth through feathers, it also makes a certain kind of sense. The rich have always loved to collect things that others can't afford to maintain. Horses, rare dogs, exotic cats. Pigeons were just another extension of that. But here's the difference. Pigeons weren't just beautiful or rare. They were functional. They could race. They could relay messages. They could be trained. So naturally, we turned them into a sport. That's when pigeon racing took off, no pun intended. Breeders began selecting birds based not only on their appearance, but on their speed endurance and ability to return home quickly. These weren't just birds anymore, they were athletes. People would bet on them, compete with them. Obsess over bloodlines and wing shapes like you would with racehorses. Some pigeons were worth thousands. Entire fortunes were built or lost over flocks of birds. It was serious business. But even beneath all the money and competition, there was something more intimate happening. A strange kind of bond. People who bred pigeons, raced them, raised them. They talked about these birds the way others talk about close friends. They weren't just investments. They were companions. And I don't know, maybe that's part of the magic. Pigeons aren't flashy. They're not exotic. They're not rare. But they connect with people, quietly, faithfully, without asking for much. And yet the more valuable they became, the more pressure we put on them. We started modifying them, crossbreeding them, altering their appearance to fit our preferences. Bigger chests, fluffier tails, unnatural colors. It was no longer just about function, it was about aesthetic, performance, control. We took this naturally gifted creature and made it perform. And I can't help but think that's a little telling about us. Because so much of our history is wrapped up in this pattern. We discover something amazing in the natural world. We celebrate it. We elevate it. Then we try to own it, mold it, monetize it. Until one day we decide we've had enough and we throw it away. But pigeons, they weren't done yet. In fact, they were just about to take on their most important role. Yet as silent heroes in one of the bloodiest chapters in modern history. And if you've never heard of pigeons in wartime, brace yourself. Because these birds didn't just carry messages, they carried lives. Chapter 6. The Bird That Wouldn't Die. You know how. Sometimes the most unassuming things turn out to be the most heroic. That's how I felt when I learned about pigeons in war. I never thought I'd get emotional over a bird, until I read about what they actually did. See, long before encrypted emails and satellite phones, armies had to rely on whatever method they could to communicate across battlefields. And in the chaos of war with radio signals, jammed wires cut messengers killed pigeons often became the last hope. At first it sounds kind of unbelievable. I mean, birds in war. But it's true. Especially during World War I and World War II, Pigeons were a vital part of military strategy. They were small, fast, nearly impossible to intercept, and best of all, they always came back. In fact, the U.S. Army Signal Corps trained over 50,000 pigeons just for World War I alone. They even had a name for the people who trained them, pigeoneers. And yes, that's a real term. These trainers would raise the birds from birth, teach them where home was, and then send them into the field with the soldiers they were assigned to. It was dangerous. A lot of pigeons didn't make it back. The enemy knew what they were doing. They'd shoot them right out of the sky to stop messages from being delivered. But some of them refused to die. And that brings me to Cher Ami. Cher Ami means dear friend in French. He was a carrier pigeon trained by the U.S. military during World War I. And on October 4th, 1918, he became a legend. That day, nearly 200 American soldiers, part of what would become known as the Lost Battalion, were trapped behind enemy lines in France. They were cut off from reinforcements surrounded by German troops, and in a horrifying twist, they were being bombed by their own side. Friendly fire. The only way to stop it was to get a message out fast. So they sent pigeons. The first one was shot down. Then the second. One by one, every single bird was killed mid-flight. Except one, Cher Ami. He was their last hope. A message was quickly written tied to his leg, and they released him into the air. Right away, enemy soldiers spotted him and opened fire. He was hit badly. A bullet tore through his chest. One of his legs was hanging on by a single tendon, and still he flew. Somehow, despite his injuries, despite the blood and chaos, Cher Ami kept going. 25 miles, in under half an hour. He made it back. The message reached command, the bombing stopped, and 194 men were saved. Cher Ami collapsed barely alive, but medics worked to save him like they would any soldier. They bandaged his wounds, amputated what was left of his leg, and tried to ease his pain. And against all odds, he survived. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, said, "There's nothing the United States can do too much for this bird." Cher Ami died a year later in 1919 from his war injuries, but his body was preserved, and to this day he's on display at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And I know it might sound silly to some honoring a pigeon like a war hero, but when I think about it, what makes someone a hero anyway? Is it the uniform, the weapons? Or is it the willingness to sacrifice to do the impossible even when no one expects it from you? Cher Ami didn't understand politics. He didn't carry hatred. He just did what he was trained to do, deliver a message. And in doing so, he saved lives. To me, that's heroism in its purest form. And Cher Ami wasn't alone. Over 150,000 pigeons served in both world wars. Some carried messages through gunfire. Others had tiny cameras strapped to their chests to capture enemy positions. And many never came back. But none of them were honored the way they deserved to be. Instead, decades later, we started calling them rats with wings. It's hard not to feel something when you realize just how far these animals have fallen in our eyes, from sacred messengers to disposable nuisances. But it wasn't always that way. And in the next chapter, I want to show you how we went from building towers to house pigeons, to building cities designed to keep them out. Because somewhere along the line, we didn't just forget their loyalty, we rewrote the story completely. Chapter 7. From Heroes to Vermin. It's strange how fast we forget. I mean, just one generation ago, pigeons were war veterans, medaled, respected, even mourned. And now they're something we dodge on sidewalks, something we shoo away like trash with wings. So what happened? How did a bird that once saved lives become one of the most hated animals in modern cities? Like a lot of things, it started with a rumor. In 1963 in New York City, 2 people died under mysterious circumstances. There wasn't a clear explanation at first, just vague reports of respiratory illness. Then a health official made a statement that would change the way we see pigeons forever. He suggested that the deaths might have been caused by disease carried by pigeons. And that was it. Just might have been. But the media ran with it. Headlines screamed about deadly pigeon plagues. People panicked. Suddenly, pigeons weren't former war heroes anymore, they were vectors of death. The public outcry was intense. Officials called for mass extermination. There were campaigns to rid the city of its estimated 5 million pigeons. People were told not to feed them, not to touch them, not to even let them land on their balconies. And it didn't matter that the theory didn't hold up. Later, it was confirmed that those two deaths had nothing to do with pigeons. The cause was a fungal infection, cryptococcal meningitis, which spreads from person to person, not bird to human. But by then, the damage was done. Pigeons had been tried in the court of public opinion and found guilty. In 1966, the New York City Parks Commissioner delivered the final blow. He called pigeons rats with wings, and that phrase stuck like glue. Overnight pigeons weren't just pests, they were filthy, disgusting, disease-ridden intruders. The same birds that had once been trained, celebrated, even loved, were now seen as nothing more than a public health threat. But here's the thing, the science doesn't support any of that. Yes, pigeon droppings can carry certain diseases, but so can the droppings of any bird or wild animal. In fact, according to multiple health agencies, the risk of contracting an illness from casual exposure to pigeon droppings is extremely low. And yet, that's not the narrative we've been told. Instead, pigeons were demonized, and the methods used to get rid of them. Honestly, they're horrifying. Spikes were installed on ledges to prevent them from landing. Sticky glue traps, electric shock systems, poison, gas. Even birth control bait was introduced to reduce reproduction. Cities launched full-blown campaigns to eradicate birds they once relied on for survival. And here's what makes it worse. Most of the pigeons we see in cities today, they're descendants of domesticated birds. Birds that we, as humans, brought with us, trained, bred, and then abandoned. Pigeons didn't evolve in skyscrapers. They evolved on cliffs. That's why they're drawn to ledges and balconies. It's in their DNA. We built cities that look like their ancient nesting grounds, and then blamed them for showing up. The irony is hard to ignore. We taught them to be loyal, to trust us, to return home. And when we no longer needed them, we didn't release them into the wild. We left them behind in environments they couldn't survive in without scavenging. And then we punished them for it. It's like we rewrote history in real time. Erased the part where they were heroes, covered up the part where they carried life-saving messages, ignored the decades of loyalty, of intelligence, of service, and reduced them to a dirty inconvenience. There's something deeply sad about that, because this isn't just about pigeons. It's about what we do to anything or anyone we no longer find useful. We lift them up when they serve a purpose. And when they don't, we turn on them. We rewrite the story so we don't have to feel guilty. We make them the villain not because they are, but because it's easier than remembering what they once meant to us. And if you think that's dramatic, just wait. Because in the next chapter, we're going to explore just how intelligent these so-called rats with wings really are. And I promise you, once you hear what pigeons are capable of, you might start seeing them a little differently. Chapter 8. Smarter than you think. After everything we've put pigeons through, the erasure, the slander, the full-on character assassination, what still surprises me most is this: they never stopped being brilliant. And I don't use that word lightly. We're so used to dismissing them as dumb, dirty birds that we forget to ask the obvious question: what if we've been wrong? What if pigeons aren't the problem, but our perception of them is? Turns out, science has been quietly trying to set the record straight, and what it's found is kind of incredible. For starters, pigeons are one of the only non-mammals on Earth that can recognize themselves in a mirror, something even dogs struggle with. They can differentiate between photographs of themselves and other pigeons, which suggests a level of self-awareness that's honestly rare even among primates. But it gets deeper. In one study, researchers trained pigeons to distinguish between Picasso and Monet paintings, like actual works of art. And guess what? The pigeons got it right consistently. They were able to categorize the paintings based on style, and even apply what they'd learned to new paintings they hadn't seen before. Think about that. A bird that most people wouldn't trust to cross the street somehow developed an eye for impressionism. And then there's memory. Pigeons can memorize hundreds of images and recall them for months, even years later. They can also understand abstract concepts like space and time, something we used to think only humans and higher mammals could do. In fact, their spatial intelligence is so strong that some researchers compare it to a GPS system hardwired into their brain. Which, if you've listened to earlier chapters, probably sounds familiar, because that's exactly how they've managed to carry messages across continents, survive in unfamiliar cities, and always find their way back. But here's what really blew my mind. In a recent study, pigeons were shown mammogram images, yes, like the kind used to detect breast cancer and trained to identify the signs of early tumors. And you know what they were, right? 85% of the time. That's not just impressive, that's terrifyingly close to the accuracy of a trained radiologist. We're talking about birds here, animals with brains the size of a walnut performing tasks we once thought were uniquely human. So no, pigeons aren't stupid. They're observant, precise, incredibly adaptive, and maybe most importantly, they're persistent. They don't give up on their instincts even when the world gives up on them. I think that's part of why their fall from grace hits so hard. Because they were never less intelligent. We just stopped paying attention. And maybe that's the most tragic part of this entire story. Because when we ignore the intelligence of something or someone, we make it easier to mistreat them, to cage them, to poison them, to dismiss them as less than. But intelligence doesn't always look like we expect. It doesn't have to come with a voice or a diploma or opposable thumbs. Sometimes it coos, sometimes it flies, sometimes it waits quietly outside your window hoping for a little bit of food, or maybe just a second chance. So now that we know the truth about their loyalty, their intelligence, their resilience, the question becomes, what do we do with it? In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what it means to rewrite a reputation, and how a few rumors and one bad nickname turned these brilliant birds into public enemies. Because if pigeons taught us anything, it's that the story we tell matters. Chapter 9. The Power of a Name. By now you probably see pigeons differently. I know I do. But even with everything we've talked about, their loyalty, their intelligence, their place in history, it still amazes me how one phrase managed to undo centuries of respect. Rats with wings, that's it. 4 words. It was catchy, it sounded gross, and it stuck. Back in 1966, New York City's Parks Commissioner used that phrase during a press conference trying to stir up public support for pigeon control. He probably had no idea that those words would shape the way generations of people would view an entire species. But they did. And that's the thing about language. Once we give something a label, especially a negative one, it becomes easy to stop thinking critically about it. Rats with wings didn't just suggest pigeons were annoying. It said they were infesting our cities, invading our lives, spreading disease, except none of that was really true. Sure, pigeons leave droppings, and yeah, they're messy, but so are plenty of animals we celebrate. No one calls squirrels rats with tails, or raccoons trash bandits, at least not with the same venom. But pigeons, we turned them into the enemy. And it wasn't just the nickname, it was the narrative. Tabloids ran horror stories about diseases that pigeons might be carrying, rarely backed by science, but always effective in getting attention. Politicians used them as easy targets during campaign seasons, promising cleaner parks, less bird poop, fewer nuisance species. And entire industries were built around keeping pigeons out. Spikes on buildings, ultrasonic repellers, even chemical repellents. Millions of dollars spent to get rid of something we brought here in the first place. That's the part I keep coming back to. Pigeons didn't migrate here on their own. They didn't sneak across borders or invade our cities. We brought them. We bred them for food. We trained them to carry messages. We used them in our wars. We shaped their behavior. We rewired their instincts to rely on us. And then when we no longer needed them, we blamed them for being here. That's not an infestation. That's abandonment. And I think that's why this story doesn't just feel like some quirky historical footnote to me. It feels personal. Not because I've ever owned a pigeon or raced one or even really thought much about them before this, but because the way we treat pigeons reflects something bigger, something uncomfortable. We live in a world obsessed with utility. If something or someone isn't useful anymore, we stop valuing it. We ignore the history, the loyalty, the complexity, and we rewrite the narrative in a way that justifies the way we discard it. And pigeons are just one example. The power of a name, a label, a rumor, it can redefine how society sees you. It can erase your past and rewrite your future. It can turn a hero into a punchline. That's what happened here. And once the story changed, it was hard to go back. People stopped remembering the pigeons that delivered life-saving messages, or the ones who returned home with bullets in their wings. They stopped seeing pigeons as companions and started seeing them as a problem. All because someone decided it was easier to hate than to understand. So where does that leave us? In the next and final chapter, I want to talk about what we do now. Now that we do understand, or at least understand more than we did before. Because if pigeons have taught us anything, it's that being underestimated doesn't erase your worth. And sometimes, the most forgotten among us are the ones who've given the most. Chapter 10. The Ones We Leave Behind. When I started researching this story, I didn't expect to feel anything. I really didn't. I thought it would be quirky, maybe even funny. A weird history kind of episode. You know, that one time a pigeon went to prison, something like that. But somewhere along the way I realized this wasn't a story about pigeons. Not really. It's a story about how we treat the things and the people we no longer find useful. It's about how easily we forget loyalty, how quickly we rewrite history when it makes us uncomfortable, how often we trade empathy for convenience, and how rarely we stop to ask ourselves why we turned something sacred into something disposable. Pigeons were there for us, for thousands of years. They fed us when we needed food. They guided our messages across mountains and oceans. They risked, and in many cases, lost their lives in our wars. They carried news hope, and sometimes even the final words of dying soldiers. And they did it without asking for anything in return. And what did we give them? A nickname, a smear campaign, and an eviction notice from the cities we taught them to call home. That part hurts the most. Because when you look at a pigeon today sitting on a fire escape or digging through a pizza crust in an alley, you're not looking at a nuisance. You're looking at a descendant of birds who were once heroes, companions, survivors. You're looking at something we molded and then abandoned. And I think that deserves to be said out loud. Because maybe it's not just about pigeons. Maybe it's about the way we as a society determine value. Maybe it's about the people who get forgotten after they've served their purpose. The ones we walk past on the street. The ones who were once celebrated and are now invisible. If we can change the story about pigeons even just a little, maybe we can start to change the way we see everything else we've cast aside. Because these birds once worshipped, then weaponized, then discarded, they're still here. Still navigating the world with their quiet intelligence. Still finding their way home even when we no longer make space for them. That persistence, that loyalty, that resilience, I don't know. I think there's something beautiful in that, something worth honoring. So the next time you see a pigeon, maybe don't shoo it away. Maybe remember where it came from, what it survived, and what it once meant to us. Because if there's one thing this story has taught me, it's this. Sometimes the most remarkable stories don't belong to kings or generals or billionaires. Sometimes they belong to the ones we forgot to thank. If this story stayed with you even just a little, I hope you carry it into your world. Because that's what we do here. We dig into the overlooked, the misunderstood, the buried truths that echo through time. And sometimes those echoes come from places we'd never expect, like a dusty rooftop or a quiet bird outside your window. If you learned something today or felt something, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how this story changed your perspective. And if you've got a story of your own, a forgotten figure, a hidden piece of history, tell me. Let's keep digging. Until next time, I'm True Crime Echoes, and this has been True Crime Echoes. Take care of yourself. And maybe leave a little food out for the ones history left behind.